You might remember the press conference on Saturday. You might have watched it, you might not. I kind of reluctantly watched it because I thought we probably should, just to see what was going to be said. And then roundly afterwards, we all thought, God, I wish I hadn't bothered watching that. Now I'm just depressed. But they decided that it would be a good idea to, instead of going to a panel of journalists or going to somebody to report from the street, that they should interview Susan Michie, a professor, a member of the government's behavioural advisory group called SPI-B, which is, of course, part of SAGE. It's another one of these organisations that we'd never heard of until relatively recently. She's been a long-standing member of the Communist Party. She's not a doctor. She's not a medical expert, but she constantly appears on various different broadcasting outlets, not on this one, and she's never been on my show, and I don't think I ever will put her on it. But basically, even scientists have now said she was the wrong choice. They shouldn't have done it, and it was over-biased. Let's talk to Brendan O'Neill, Chief Political Writer at Spiked. Brendan, a very good afternoon to you.
Hi, how's it going?
Yeah, very well indeed. I remember thinking, as soon as they went to her after that press conference, well, that's the most ridiculous choice of a person to interview that I've ever seen. Because surely to God, what you would have wanted was to go maybe to South Africa to talk to somebody down there about the variant, maybe to a hospital to talk to a doctor about what was happening in the actual hospitals of this country. But instead they go to a behavioural scientist who constantly says we should be doing more to lock everybody down.
Absolutely. You know, as you're saying, shock horror, the BBC is biased. And the fact that they went to Susan Michie, who, as you say, is a member of the Communist Party, is a well-known left-winger, for comment on what the government was doing. I mean, on one level, it was unsurprising, but on another level, it's just depressing because you have these prominent left-wing voices who just want more and more restriction, more and more regulations. Ideally, they want us all in lockdown for the rest of time by the looks of things. And it's not surprising that someone who comes from an authoritarian communist party or who's been a member of an authoritarian communist party would be making the case for constant social distancing, constant mask wearing, no regard whatsoever for a small thing called freedom. So it was pretty shocking, and it was pretty typical that the BBC went to her rather than anyone else.
Yes, but it's interesting that it's the scientists this time who are actually being critical. It's not other journalists, it's not people like me or you, it's actual scientists who are saying that this was the wrong choice of guest. And a guy called Raghib Ali, Senior Clinical Research Associate at the University of Cambridge, and also Simon Clark, who we talk to quite a lot, who's a pretty straight-shooting guy and certainly isn't against lockdown at all, just says this was entirely wrong. But the thing that puzzles me, Brendan, is how many times this woman gets interviewed for this stuff, and she's not really in any way qualified.
She's all over the place. She's on the media all the time. And, you know, she's a behavioural scientist, which has always struck me as a rather strange job to have. You know, this idea that these people have this special expert insight into human behaviour, as if they're studying like amoeba under a microscope or something. It's always struck me as a very patrician form of science. And she's been interviewed all the time. And I think the reason why is because her views chime with the liberal media's views. And the liberal media has been hectoring the government for tougher regulations and whipping up fear about COVID for a long time. So her views, which is that it's all pretty disastrous and we should distance forever and we should wear masks as all the time in every building, those views chime, I think, with the prejudices of some of the liberal media who also live in fear of COVID and want to clamp down on how people behave. So it's not surprising that she gets called on so often.
No, exactly right. Because it's funny, you probably saw, as I did at the weekend, there was a video going around, a compilation of all the things that had been said about mask wearing from the likes of Chris Whitty and Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson and everybody else. Because at the time when they wanted to push social distancing, mask wearing wasn't thought to be important. So they kind of downplayed the importance of wearing a mask and basically said, we don't think it makes any difference. Now suddenly they want you to think that that's changed.
It just doesn't add up at any level at all. You know, on the one hand, we're told that this new variant is potentially really scary and could be really transmissible and really virulent and really dangerous. And then their solution is put on a mask. And you think it just doesn't marry up. You know, this is as scary as the headlines say, which I very much doubt that it is. And I'll keep my fingers crossed on that. Then obviously putting on a piece of cloth when you go shopping, but not when you go to the pub, makes no sense at all. So there's a very performative element, I think, to some of these rules. It's about the government saying, well, we're doing something. And it's about ordinary people thinking, having this false sense of security, I think, as if when you put on a mask, you'll be safe from everything. So the mask wearing in particular doesn't add up to me at all. Do we need tough measures or not? That's the question. My view is that we don't. We've had rather enough of them. Not more than 90% of Brits have got antibodies at one level or another. We're vaccinated very well. This is possibly a more transmissible, but it could be a milder version of COVID. We have to just take it on the chin and see how we go and take measures if things get bad. That's the kind of approach we should be taking, I think.
I think so too, because never has so much been said about something of which we know so little, because in the same time as saying, oh, we think it might the vaccines might be ineffective against the new variant. So in that case, you better just have another vaccine. And you kind of go, well, that's kind of logically a bit of a fallacy, isn't it? If you're telling us that it gets around the first two, why wouldn't it get around the third,
Yeah, and the other thing is that the government and sections of the media are clearly addicted to worst case scenario thinking. They're always going to the worst case scenario. This could be a complete and utter disaster. And the line that they push out is that it's better to be safe than sorry. But that's not always the case, because the point is that restrictions have consequences too. And restrictions, the restrictions at the moment are fairly mild, although it looks like people may have to cancel trips abroad because PCR tests are expensive and ordinary working people often can't afford that. People won't be able to visit family in certain countries because they've been added to the red list. So these are pretty severe consequences. But if the restrictions get worse, or if more are enforced between now and Christmas, they have an impact too on the economy, on people's sense of mental health and mental well-being, on our sense of being members of a society. All of that stuff is interfered with by these endless restrictions. So the idea that switching things off and going back to lockdown light has no consequences at all is a complete fantasy, and we have to be careful with the measures that we take.
Well, that's right. And much of what they've said about the PCR test coming back has actually got consequences for people. It might mean that some people now won't be able to go on holiday, or won't be able to go and see their relatives, or won't be able to afford to pay the extra cost that will come to because of the new rules. But more worryingly than that is the uncertainty of not knowing until the 18th of December whether it's going to get any worse or whether it's going to get any better.
I think that uncertainty is absolutely key to the problem here, because people feel that they're not in control of their own lives. We feel like we're no longer the master of our own destinies, because we know that we could wake up one day and have fewer freedoms than we did the day before. Yeah. Liberty is being snatched away at a moment's notice every time a new variant emerges. The thing is, variants of COVID are always going to emerge for the foreseeable future anyway. That's what viruses do. They mutate. We can't respond like this to every new variant. And, there's a class question here as well. The reason people like Professor Susan Michie and many others can make these kinds of calls for strong measures or possibly even a lockdown in the future, they have nice lives. They can work from home. They probably live in lovely big houses with lovely big gardens. That's not the case for most people. Many people live in smaller conditions. They have to go out to work. Right. If they don't work, they can't make ends meet. So there's a class difference here too. And I think a lot of the kind of posh leftists who want lockdown aren't thinking of the consequences that would have on less well-off people.
Oh, of course not. And they never did think that. And they always did expect people who were around them, doing things for them, to move around. Even if they weren't doing it, they want the Amazon guy to come up every day with his presents. They want the food delivery people, the wine delivery people. Everybody gets food delivered now. And it's just, it is a shocking state of affairs, because, it seems to be that those who think that being better being safe than sorry have bought the idea that you are safer if you wear a mask and if you work from home. And there's never has been any real evidence about what it is that spreads this ghastly virus, and why some people get it worse than others, why some people don't get it at all. I've been fortunate enough that I've never had it, as far as I know, in all the time that I've been working, and I've never been off work at all. In terms of, I've been travelling, I've been on the tube, I've been out, I've been to shops regularly. You would think if it was that virulent, I would have come across it at some point.
Well, the thing is, you're absolutely right that this neglect that they have for people who have to carry on working and have to go out into the world where this, what they describe as a terrible virus is. They don't mind other people going out to face down this virus. The people who make their deliveries, their food, the stuff they buy online, the refuse collectors. I always think about dustbin men. Imagine if they had been furloughed during the various lockdowns, we would have called it off in an instant, because society would come to a standstill standstill if people who do important jobs like that, keeping places clean, if they stopped working, then it would be a complete disaster. So you have all these, you know, comfortably off people at home lecturing the rest of us about how we behave, while armies of people carry on working so that they can have their comfortable lockdown existences. I find that really quite repulsive, actually.
Yeah.
And you know, we do now have to learn to live with the virus in a meaningful way. And what that means is we've got to start seeing it like flu and cold. It will always be around. It's now part of the family of human diseases. Yes, people will get sick. Yes, we should treat people who get very sick. But that's part of life, and we can't keep bringing life to a standstill.
No, they really have to get out of that habit, because I think, but I've spoken to quite a few people this week already who have more or less said, and one of them was Dan Hodges, so you know that it's cutting through to people like him, it must be true, that this will probably be the last time anyone believes the government, because if in fact this does turn out to be not very serious, people will go, okay then, well maybe you shouldn't have been quite so quick to do what you did. Maybe you should have waited a little while to see. But of course they're also under pressure from people like Susan Michie, who are constantly saying, oh, lockdown more, lockdown faster, you know, shut everything.
I think the story of the past 20 months has been exactly that, you know, huge pressure on the government to enforce tougher measures all the time. A lot of that pressure comes from sections of the media. I think that much of the media has behaved shamefully over the COVID era. You know, they're just constantly pressing for regulations, not asking sufficient questions about the impact of those regulations on the economy, on health, on undiagnosed cancers, on children's education. Lots of children are far behind in their education now. They don't think about those consequences. And often they don't think about them because they don't have to. You know, their children, as we know from statistics, privately educated children or children who went to more middle-class schools got a good education while schools were closed, while many kids who went to state schools did not get a good education. So again and again, the class divide is widening all the time. Government and others are not thinking about the consequences these measures have on everyday people. And that's why we can't carry on like this. We can't keep jumping at shadows, bringing back restrictions. We have to live with the virus, get on with life, and I would say cancel all restrictions.
Well, I mean, this is the thing, and a lot of people, and some of the medical people, are saying if it is a weaker form of COVID, and if it is more transmissible, then that means it's a good piece of news, because it means that the mutation is now going in the right direction, i.e., you know, more people can get it, but less people will actually be ill.
Yeah, but you know, I was reading some of that and I was thinking, this is so revealing, because you're not allowed to have good news stories these days. No. Everything has to be a bad news story. Everything has to be about doom and terror and the horrors of the future. So there is this addiction to apocalyptic thinking. You know, the end of the world is always just around the corner. We saw that with COP26 as well, of course, you know, the climatic end of the world. Now we have the COVID-induced end of the world, always, you know, a moment's notice away. So there is this apocalyptic sense amongst the government itself and significant sections of the media. And that's the thing I think people are tiring of. They're tiring of living in a society where we're constantly told that we're at risk. Doom could befall us any minute. People, that's very wearying to hear that all the time.
It really is. I mean, I was listening to another radio station at the weekend, mistakenly, and they were banging on about the storm as if it was some kind of apocalyptic, you know, event, which was, you know, about to sweep the north of England and kill thousands of people. I mean, that was the tone in which the reports were being made. And I just thought, you know, it's a storm. Yeah, some people have been hurt. A couple of people actually did die. Some trees fell down, you know, but it's hardly, you know, the end of the world.
Yeah, and Greens refer to it as weather of mass destruction, which I think sums up apocalyptic thinking right now. But it's true, everything that happens to society, and there are bad things that happen. There are bad storms, there are bad viruses, there are terrible accidents, of course there are, but everything gets filtered through this apocalyptic lens. So everything has to be a sign of end times. You know, the Green movement is the world leader at interpreting events through that lens. What these people often neglect to mention is that life has improved enormously for the vast majority of people who do not live at the mercy of nature in the way that we used to. No. They don't die at a young age from easily treated viruses or abscesses or other sicknesses. Right. We're now able to treat that. We've got to start looking on the good side. You know, the good news is that we live in a more comfortable, healthier, wealthier society than we ever did before. And the doom mongers, I think what the doom mongers are doing, especially the COVID doom mongers, they're really pressing onto people this sense that we are vulnerable, we're at risk, it's not safe to go outside, your fellow citizen is a potential vector of disease. It's just spreading this dread and this distrust, and we're getting locked into a spiral of doom, and we've got to find a way out of it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Very well said, Brendan. Thank you so much. Brendan O'Neill, Chief Political Writer at Spiked. With